From the very first moment Harrison Avery stepped into the dimly lit restaurant, he felt something crack inside him, something he had carefully kept sealed for years. It was supposed to be just another blind date arranged by a well-meaning colleague, another attempt to break the suffocating monotony of his billionaire CEO life, another evening where he would sit across a stranger and pretend he wasn't empty inside. But tonight felt different, heavier. The air felt too still, the lights too sharp, and the shadows too familiar, as if the past had walked in before he did. What he didn't expect was that his blind date wouldn't show up, but someone else would, someone fate had been waiting to reintroduce at the most unexpected moment. Within minutes, the disaster he expected would turn into the most life-changing encounter of his entire existence. If you believe in kindness, healing, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support truly helps stories like this reach more hearts. Harrison didn't care about dates. He didn't care about relationships. His life was a long boardroom with no windows, a constant march of numbers, mergers, and expectations. For years, he buried the ache of losing his parents as a teenager, of abandoning the small Texas town he grew up in, and the memories of the one girl who once made the world feel safe, Clara Morgan. She had been the quiet, warm, brave girl next door who used to braid daisies into his hair, who held his hand the day he cried over his mother's illness, who promised him there was still beauty left in the world. But life pulled him to New York. She disappeared into a different path, and the world became noise. Tonight, however, as he sat at his table waiting for the blind date who had already texted to cancel, Harrison's eyes were drawn to a woman rushing through the restaurant door, struggling with a little boy in her arms and a small backpack falling apart over her shoulder. Her hair was a mess of tired curls, her clothes worn, her face exhausted. But the moment she looked up, the world slammed into him. It was her, Clara. Older, thinner, with shadows under her eyes and pain etched into her expression, but unmistakably the same Clara who once made his young heart dream of something soft and real. Clara, however, didn't see him at first. She wasn't there for a date. She wasn't even a guest. She was there delivering food, working a second job after hours at a nearby diner to make the last rent payment she owed before being thrown out of her tiny apartment in Newark. Her son, 4-year-old Mason, was clinging to her like a lifeline, refusing to be left with the neighbor again because he'd had a nightmare. And Clara couldn't say no. She never could. When the restaurant manager scolded her for bringing a child to work, Clara apologized repeatedly, her voice shaking, and Harrison felt something twist painfully inside him. She looked like she was breaking, fighting, surviving, but breaking. When her eyes finally met his, the tray nearly slipped from her hands. It was like watching two lost universes collide. She tried to look away, embarrassed by her appearance, but he stood up before he could stop himself. He walked toward her, every step echoing the years he had missed, the dreams he had buried. The manager barked at her to hurry. Clara bowed her head, whispered sorry again, and rushed to deliver the takeout order. She didn't approach Harrison, didn't assume he wanted to speak to her. Why would a billionaire CEO, impeccably dressed, sitting alone at a table worth more than her monthly income, want to reconnect with someone who could barely afford diapers? But Harrison followed her outside after she left the building. Clara didn't see him until she bent down to place Mason in an old stroller, her hands trembling from stress. When she turned, startled by his voice calling her name, her eyes filled with panic. Not joy, not nostalgia, but the kind of fear life forces into a person who has lost too many battles. She tried to smile, tried to tell him she was fine, that life was good, but the lie fell apart instantly. Her voice cracked. Mason tugged at her sleeve, asking for food. Clara's shoulders slumped, and Harrison, who had built an empire from ruins, felt utterly helpless for the first time in years. He insisted on walking them to the bus stop. She resisted, then reluctantly allowed it because she was too tired to pretend anymore. On the ride, she told him pieces of her story, how she had fallen in love with a man who promised marriage, only to be abandoned during her pregnancy. How she worked 2 jobs, nanny by day, diner runner by night. how she barely slept, how she had no family left, how she had stopped believing life owed her anything except survival. She didn't mention hunger, but Harrison saw Mason's thin arms. She didn't mention eviction, but Harrison saw the 48-hour notice sticking out of her backpack. She didn't mention loneliness, but her trembling hands spoke for her. When they arrived at her rundown apartment complex, Harrison felt sick. No locks, no heat, a single mattress, piles of used clothing, a broken window patched with tape. He had more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet Clara, his Clara, was living like this. But Clara wasn't asking for help. She wasn't even complaining. She simply placed Mason on the mattress, kissed his forehead, and began folding laundry for her nanny job the next morning. That was when Harrison realized the depth of her strength, not in her survival, but in her silence. He left that night unable to think, unable to breathe properly. He went home and stood in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, surrounded by everything money could buy. He had always known he was lonely, but now the emptiness felt unbearable because he had seen what real pain looked like. Hers. The next morning, Harrison made a decision that would turn his life upside down. He drove to Clara's apartment with breakfast, groceries, and an offer. One she almost didn't let him finish. He asked her to work for him, to be Mason's nanny at his private residence where she would be safe, paid generously, and have time to rest. Clara refused. She didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to feel like a burden. But he told her the truth, that she was the only person from his past who ever made him feel safe, that he owed her more than she could imagine, and that sometimes accepting help was an act of courage, not weakness. After hours of hesitation, her tears finally broke the last wall she had built, and she whispered a trembling yes. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Harrison's home, once cold and silent, slowly transformed. He woke to Mason's laughter echoing through the halls, to Clara humming while making breakfast, to a warmth he never knew he was missing. He found himself waiting for her smile, noticing how she tried to hide her sadness, how she flinched whenever someone raised their voice, how she worked harder than anyone he'd ever hired. He began to fall for her, not because she was his childhood love, but because she was everything his world lacked. Kind, honest, resilient, compassionate. And Mason adored him, climbing onto his lap with effortless trust, calling him Mr. Harrison, mispronouncing his name in a way that made Harrison's heart melt every time. But Clara fought her feelings. She reminded herself she was poor, a single mom, a woman with scars, and he was a billionaire, a CEO, someone who could choose anyone. She didn't see that Harrison had already chosen. The turning point came on a stormy night when Mason woke up crying from fever. Clara panicked, desperate and shaking. Harrison rushed in, holding Mason, soothing him, calling his private doctor, staying by Clara's side the entire night. When Mason finally slept, Clara broke down completely, sobbing into her hands from fear, exhaustion, and the terror of almost losing the only thing that gave her life meaning. Harrison pulled her close without thinking, holding her as she wept, promising she wasn't alone anymore. She tried to pull away, tried to apologize, but he held her gently, telling her that she deserved rest, love, comfort, that she deserved a life where she didn't have to be strong every second of every day. And in that quiet moment, with the storm raging outside, Clara allowed herself to lean into him for the first time. From there, everything began to change. Harrison helped her find a better home, helped her pursue the teaching degree she had abandoned years ago, helped her rebuild her confidence piece by piece, not with money, not with pity, but with support, respect, and time. And slowly, cautiously, Clara allowed herself to dream again. Their love didn't explode. It unfolded, gently, carefully, like something sacred. 1 year later, at a small park in New Jersey where Clara used to take Mason to play, Harrison knelt down, not with a grand gesture or photographers, but with tears in his eyes and a ring trembling between his fingers. He asked Mason first if he could marry his mommy. Mason squealed yes. Clara sobbed, and the sunset washed them in gold as she whispered the word that changed everything. Yes. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world. Before the ending, please comment, love deserves a second chance. Harrison's blind date had been a disaster. But fate had a better plan. It led him back to the woman who once gave him faith, and now gave him a family. And in the end, the lonely CEO and the struggling nanny wrote a story not of wealth, but of healing. Proof that sometimes the greatest love is the one that finds you when you least expect it.